Maybe just to kind of start the conversation, I was thinking while both of you were talking that I think I came into this moderation being slightly intimidated because I feel like I'd been far away from academia for a long time. I was a bit worried, like, would I be able to connect with this kind of academic world that your CVs are presenting? But it was so sensuous, and it was so desire-filled, and it was so full of imagery and making me connect with the content of what you were saying on this sort of very embodied level. So there's really this deeply rooted interdisciplinary practice with arts, with environmental justice groups that goes so beyond the university. And I really appreciated that. Can you maybe both talk a little bit to how these relations form in and out of your work at the university? And I'm also specifically thinking about a beautiful text that I found by Eve Tuck that you had referenced, Murphy, in one of your texts, which was
suspending damage.
And Tuck was also talking about, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this concept of how sometimes perhaps the gathering of data in a desire-filled way is better done by a community and maybe not a well-meaning researcher. So there is this very important establishing of relations between those conducting science and those who have maybe historically been objects of this science. And I saw it also coming back in your relationship with the sort of sensuous aspects of science as well. So maybe we can start there.
I feel like you should. No, you go. I will if you would.
No, you go. I want to just think.
I think we got these things.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we're good.
So thank you for that question. Yes, so our lab, and I know in the opening comments, Max Liberon's Clear Lab kind of came up together. And Eve Tuck, who was also at the University of Toronto, unfortunately she just left, but developed the Circle Lab. And so we all know each other and are in co-thinking about both the relationship between pollution and colonialism and desire-based or non-damage-based work. So how I think about desire-based work, the first thing is that in our lab, we are a group of, right now we're all indigenous. Sometimes we're not all indigenous. People who are refusing to be studied by the university. The university likes to study indigenous people and study the harms that have been done to them, or capture their testimonies, or blood samples, or hair samples from their bodies to no end. And in Chemical Valley or at Amsterdam, there's been plenty of studies. They have not done a thing. And so what our lab does is we are an indigenous lab studying settler colonial practices, settler colonial science, settler colonial industry, settler colonial state, for our own desires. So it's desire-based in that way. We are studying violence, but we're studying violence because we're trying to enact our own desire of land back, of indigenous justice, of activating indigenous jurisdiction, and so on. But desire in this work is not the desire of the subject, the individual subject. Desire has to come out of a community process of coming into some kind of agreement about what is to be done. And in that community process, people have different roles. So I am Red River Métis. I am not from Amsterdam First Nation. So my role is not to impose my personal desire onto processes, right? But to activate collective desire that's decided by a community review process involving elders, youth, land defenders, sometimes chief and council and so on, to decide this kind of orientation. So that's a little bit about our approach to desire. I mean, maybe I'll say one last thing is because we are studying a form of intensive violence. It's easy for me to say 57 facilities or briefly show you that map or that one event. But, to think about 150 years of kind of unbridled environmental violence on an indigenous community combined with state genocide, it's a dark area to study. Like it's hard on the heart and the feelings and mental health and senses of self-worth. And so it is really important in our work that we try to make it beautiful, that we try to make all our meetings joyful. So we'll have feasting, we'll have fires, we'll play bingo. We must come together in a way that feels good in order to take on this thing we're taking on. And that's another kind of like desire-based, how we becoming each other in our livingness as well as in this kind of death infrastructure that we're confronting.
Oh, I don't even know how to follow that up. I am so fortunate to have learned from people like Murphy and so many of the people you cited in your talk. Like the question of, being inside and outside of spaces like the university is a really complicated one, I think, and one that for me just becomes more and more complicated as the university, I think, becomes increasingly reveals itself for its implication in all kinds of worldly violences. And, it is that, and it is also a place where many people can find refuge and an opportunity to think and be and try out different ways of living this kind of desirable relationship to knowledge. And it's such a incommensurable relationship. So I think for myself, like what Murphy just said about, we all have our own roles to play. And I think, I am the university, like I am it. I can't deny that. I get paid by the university. That's where I work. So a lot of what I'm trying to do a little bit is, and I know you definitely do this, like the whole Trojan horsing of, how can we take these resources and redirect them and put them back into places where that other kind of desirous relationship to knowledge in the world can find fertile ground in which to grow. So maybe I'll just say that for now. I mean, there's more I could say about this question and like working inside and outside, but I suppose for me, it's really about also never forgetting that I am the university, so that like, I know that is my responsibility to then also try to keep prying it open and changing it like in an impossible way, right? It's so deeply what it is. And like, my university is primarily a land developer. Like that is its main job, is to develop and make money from land that it stole. And then it also kind of has some university programs. So, like that is really deeply ingrained, but nonetheless, what are the places of refugia within, and what are the places that we can still build other worlds within, because as we continue to be confused and entangled in all of this, or as I do, there's no clear outside and inside, so it's always kind of what am I capable of working on from within and being outside too. And I think, like this project I talked about, the one with my sister, a lot of that is an example of continually being a little bit always getting thrown up in the air, like what is science? What is language? What is poetry? What is feeling? What is, the university? What is outside of it? And realizing, for me at least, that the security of having very clear-cut distinctions between these things just kind of falls away. And that's okay. It's then like, how do we like work within that falling away?
I was also thinking a bit about, you were mentioning in the beginning, you weren't quite sure why you were taking the pictures of the kelp. And I was fascinated by how there were almost two stories being told. You were telling a beautiful story through language, through poetry, but then of course there was this very sensuous, tactile story being told through those images. And I could feel this like some of them were so blurry because you were so up close in a way, and I could feel this desire in a way to extend your body into the kelp, maybe. Or I was also thinking, you were mentioning the phantom limb, and I once read this crazy study about immunology. As I was mentioning earlier, I've been really interested in immunology as a field and how it reflects on our society and things like this, specifically out of the pandemic. But there was a study about how studying the phantom limb, that there was a relationship then also with the immune system actually thinking that there was a phantom limb. So there's this idea of the sense of bodily self being extended out into parts of the body that aren't there. This sounds very complicated, but just go with me. I was just thinking, like that there was in both of your presentations this other story being told that was non-language based. I was wondering if you could speak to that, or if I'm grasping at the right thing there.
I mean, it's all connected. I don't know, like when you say that, I'm picturing also the images that Murphy showed of Christy Balcourt's work,
Exactly, yeah. But like we had the data, the hard data, but then there was so much being told in those images as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think part of that photography kind of project I'm working on is partly also comes from how much I've learned from working with artists. Like I'm not an artist myself, but I'm really interested in methodologies I've sort of absorbed, I think, from working a lot with artists, which has been a lot about try it out. What does the material world tell you? And so I think that project is sort of coming from that. But, it's also about both the magic and the inadequacy of my language, And I really loved that, Murph, in your talk, you spoke about land and language, as the same thing. But that's not the language necessarily that I learned. So, like, what does it mean to try to find or grow or learn a language that is more coming from the world, is also, I think, part of my my desire.
Sort of an unlearning of this hierarchy of language, maybe being the only way of describing the world. Yeah. I was also thinking a bit about. I felt that in both of your talks there were also sort of like a suggestion of kind of like acts of noticing or almost like a daily practice of being with alter life or learning feeling. And I was thinking a bit about this field of microphenomenology that's kind of like I guess almost this scientific practice of really like becoming attuned to being part of these relations, both the beautiful ones, but also accepting the difficult relations and the implications that we're all part of, and not trying to push those nasty things away, such as PCBs and microplastics and things like this. And I was thinking about a moment I had with another Canadian scholar, Alexis Shotwell, who wrote a book called Against Purity, urging us to not purge ourselves or enter into these kind of purity politics, they call it, as a way of disowning our shared but uneven bodily load of these chemicals and processes. And I I thought about that a lot, and I think it hit me in a way that sort of was a bit uncomfortable, but I think it's also helped me. And I think, for instance, reading your work on bodies of water during the pandemic, where in the beginning we were all so scared of the permeability of our bodies and the aerosols and all these things that we were sort of becoming aware of, that I thought, I often think about this sort of daily practicing of becoming a body of water, or maybe becoming alter life. Does that resonate with you? Is that something you think about daily when you're making your coffee, or?
I feel like you should answer.
Long-winded question.
Well, I mean, I think it's one of those things that is both always there and could be never there, right? Any of this, whether it's, okay. I mean, of course, it's something we can easily background in our lives or pay attention to. But I don't think that's just the case for, an embodied sensation or a sensorium of sort of understanding what I'm drinking when I drink the coffee. I mean, I love the way that it's also about how we read data, or how we understand what's going on around us. Like, all of that can be like a practice of attunement all the time, right? I mean, do I do it all the time, every day? No, of course, no, because that would be far too overwhelming. And I think that's the idea of porosity can be a beautiful and romantic idea, but it's also deadly, and it's also overwhelming, and it's also something that sometimes some of us want to not look at. So, I mean, I'm also a little bit wary of the sort of, I mean, I think this is something I struggle with always in my work, is this tendency to sort of romanticizing a feeling of connection, right? Or of porosity, or of flow. It can be so aestheticized. And so it can draw you in with its sort of nuance and connotations, but I don't want to flow into everything, and I think, what you were talking about, like, so much of those exposures are non-consensual, the vast majority of them. So I think it's really complicated. Like, I don't want to just sort of say, yes, we should all just become more porous to the world. Like, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think what kind of also stuck out with both talks is that, yes, we are in relation, but not equally so, right? So that awareness always needs to be there, so that it isn't just, everything is flowing. I was just coming back quickly to Alexis Shotwell. She was talking about indicator species, so species that are at sort of the frontier of some extremely contaminated environment, and that we look to them as these kind of canaries in the coal mine. And I was thinking a lot about this sort of, seeking out a community and looking at them as canaries in the coal mine. And speaking with Alexis, she was urging me to think of myself as an indicator species in a way, rather than in this sort of anthropological way, always looking outside of one's body. So I think that's also kind of like what resonated with me a bit with the alter life and the sort of refusing of study that you were talking about, Murphy.
Yeah, I can maybe say something about that. In the framework that or the kind of worlding that I'm trying to offer with place thought, the birds are knowledge holders. And they've also been through a lot. They've also been through the arrival of colonialism and its violences. And in Anishinaabe and Métis pedagogy, when let's say you want to learn how to be a good leader, you study the birds. So this sentinel species is one way of thinking about how we might be co-learning with others who maybe have long been in the same kind of dispossessions that humankin have been in. I've gotten, for a while I got really obsessed by this fish called the round goby. It's in the Caspian Sea, and it was brought into the Great Lakes through, in the ballast water of international ships, and, became a, quote, invasive species. And it is about this big. And it really thrives in highly contaminated spots, corners. And not only does it thrive there, it loves to make nests in garbage and detritus. And I think in part because other things don't necessarily thrive there. It thrives. And in becoming in those spaces and developing in relationship to the endocrine participating chemicals that are concentrated there, the round gobies in those spaces have many more gender expressions than round gobies in non-contaminated spaces, and many more ways of being romantic together than round gobies in other spaces, and thrive. And so there's something do I want to see the goby? And so scientists go to gobies and they look at them and they look for signal changes, right, in their genital size, their urinary papilla, or they look for the presence of yolk in the fish testicles and so on, as the sentinels, right, of oh, this kind of contamination, or this, can we use them as sentinel markers? And at the same time, because they're invasive species, they're to be exterminated. You don't, right? In the name of the purity of some fantasy of this highly disturbed, this place completely disturbed by colonialism and racial capitalism could have some natural ecosystem or something. So there is a kind of relationship to the sentinel, but I think there's other ways too of coming to an understanding of kinship, or coming into an understanding of co-learning with non-human kin, for which the lessons are sometimes hard and painful, and not just happy. Going back to the question about the wanting to romanticize, I brought up Monsanto. If I was going to build out from the round goby, who carries a burden of PCBs for sure, well, Monsanto is one of its grandfathers. Mm-hmm. So what do we do with then our sentinel kinships? They are actual ethical political responsibilities to then call out, or what is the ethical political responsibility to those kin that are violently killing, but who we are deeply related to, and also facilitate our living, like Monsanto. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of where I go in thinking about some of the organisms that get taken up as sentinel species.
And then also, with that round goby example, how are then these descendants of these violent histories also teaching us new ways to live?
Exactly.
Right? This biodiversity of gender as a climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy. Really, that's what's happening. This proliferation of ways of being romantic and genders as a response to this maybe
heteropatriarchy is not the way to get through this thing.
Yeah, exactly. There are other ways to do it. So, and those lineages are just not clear and pure, right? And they, that insistence on responsibility looking backwards and forwards, and now.
I was thinking this is maybe my last question, I want to really open it up to everybody. But that sort of brings me back to your questions around the wagging finger of anthropomorphism, which I thought was very liberating in a way, of feeling not being contained within the human body, and the sort of a less Cartesian view, as you were also mentioning, on the human body as being sort of extending beyond the skin, coming back maybe to the porosity. And it reminded me a little bit also of a chapter in your book that I mentioned before called Strange Kinship. So how can we learn from the amorphous blob that we perhaps at the bottom of the sea, that perhaps we have a lot of kinship with in some way, and you're I remember you writing about, it's often a problem in environmental conservation that whales have red beating hearts, that they feel sadness. We can sort of relate to them, but how can we relate and repeat ourselves in the amorphous blob that is so, it's maybe perhaps more difficult to feel this kinship with?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the problem of anthropomorphism is just like, it's such a red herring, like it's such a distraction. I think like if we pay attention to Anishinaabe or Syilx language in Silixian or any other like land-based land languages, then of course, what we are learning and the words that we put those things into are not from inside of us. Like that, I mean, that doesn't even make sense. Like we were like not dropped down from some alien spaceship with language fully formed inside of us. Like it just makes no sense. But I find it so humorous and interesting that particularly like environmental humanities scholars are so hung up on this, right? As though we would somehow bring language, like extend our language out into the world. It's like, well, where did we get that language from in the first place? So, that sort of part of the talk, I hope, is almost like old-fashioned now. Like, I hope we don't have to keep rehashing that. It feels a little bit like not the main question. But the question of kinship, I'm also, I'm so indecisive about so many things. I think it's a really interesting question and a problem, because I think it's also, again, very easy to just flagrantly extend kinship all around. Like, I'm related to this and I'm related to that, and we're kin and I'm kin with this and kin with this. It's an easy thing to claim and a much more difficult thing to practice. So more than the question of claiming a kinship, I would be interested in how are we practicing kinship with other things beyond our, whatever kind of kinship unit that is sanctioned by whatever society we live in, And I think that practice is a very different thing. So I think that, in a way, Murphy already answered that in terms of like, how do we practice being related to the round goby whose grandfather is also Monsanto? So what is that responsibility to that kinship, is then the question of activism and politics and everyday living in different ways.
Thank you. I wanted to open it up. Different forms of practicing. Yes.
Hey, just wanted to say thank you again for such amazing talks. I kind of wanted to just pick up the thread of what you were just talking about with the goby. And I don't think that there is an easy answer to this. But when we talk about harm done by plasticizers and endocrines and the way that they create gender deviance in different species, I think that we can't call that harm, right? It's not harmful for there to be more gender deviance and more gender biodiversity. But also, if we can't call it harm, we are also then maybe arguing a little bit on the side, or like we have this uneasy allegiance with the plastic companies who also say that it is not harmful. And I'm wondering a little bit how you would navigate that tension. I don't think it has an easy answer, but it's something I think about a lot, especially in this time when there are so many kind of incensatory newspaper articles about that are very transphobic or very queerphobic in the Anthropocene, and yeah.
Want to start?
Sure. I think that you can say that non-consensual exposures are unethical. At the same time, you can say that the bodily developments that derive from non-consensual exposures, you can refuse their pathologization. And so I don't think that it has to be to bring non-judgment or even appreciation to the heterogeneity of gender and sexual becoming. Doesn't stop one from getting interested in the question of non-consensual and consensual exposures. So we could have consensual exposures in relationship to the goby if we pay attention to the ways they like to nest or how they like to assemble and participate in creating conditions for their intergenerational thriving. So sometimes you can have variation of expression, bodily expression, but not necessarily intergenerational thriving. What's cool about the round goby is you got both. When I think about this in relationship to birds, I get very excited because most birds don't have penises, and very few do, like ostriches do, but most of them just have holes, or called quackla, that do a lot of work. They have like one hole that does everything. And so bird genitalia is really hole on hole, and it doesn't have to activate in the same way that so much trans hatred activates in terms of the variety of gender expression and sexual expression. So I find that really interesting too. And then, of course, the developments that happen in relationship to endocrine participating chemicals go beyond sexual or gender and move into your cardiovascular system and your neurology and your brain development and so on. And so the stakes of the becoming comes into alter life in a great more, in so many more forms than just the obsession with sex. So I don't know if that gives a little bit more of a, just some texture to work one's way through the general compunction to stigmatize or pathologize in the scientific literature.
I'm also curious because normally I would have said endocrine disrupting chemical, but you say endocrine participating.
Yeah.
And that is such a important change of language. So I think that's also maybe relating back to this question, what kind of language do we actually use, and what possible harm can that language bring forth when it's put into the wrong contexts?
Mm-hmm. I'll say this. We might have a body that makes a lot of estrogen. We never asked for that. That was non-consensual. So we can, thinking this way about really the variety of internal and external exposures, the variety of endocrine participations, and their internalization and externalization, I think at least gives some wiggle room to get out of either just the normal pathological thing or the liberal subject. that's either this or chooses that. Because we're never in a state of full choosing.
That's right. And we would never be in a state of only consensual exposure.
Never.
It's
We
live in the world. Right?
Exactly.
And, I think that your question too, Hannah, it reminds me of this essay written by Eli Clare called Meditations on Natural Worlds, where he's speaking with a friend, and I'm sorry, I haven't read the article in a little while, and I forget exactly the conditions of the conversation, but the friend who has been made ill by exposure to military chemicals says, I'm talking with my friend, and, we're trying to come up with a slogan that we can get behind. And that slogan is, I can love my body and hate the military. So it's not like by loving a body, we have to love all of the ways in which it came to be. And so separating out, well, never clearly separating, but, having some texture around, these different pathways is really crucial, in fact.
Yeah, I was actually also thinking a lot about Eli Clare and this sort of what we can learn from disability studies in general about how our bodies are, from before we're conceived, defined by our environment, and how we can not necessarily having to sort of try to eliminate that relationship, because that's impossible, but we can still resist the inequality with which some bodies are exposed and others are not. So yeah, huge recommendation also. More questions?
Yes, this is a bit more also relating to, I think, the very first question you mentioned. I was wondering a bit more about kind of the connection between academics, arts, and activism. And this might be very open and vague, but also relating to direct action, and especially now with this very well documented current genocide going on, how you might position yourself within this with your own academic research, but also art and I don't know, it's a very personal way of positioning yourself in this. But I think the way of taking time for reflection in academics, but also then with when something is so urgent, kind of, I hope this makes sense. Yeah, that's my question.
Do you want to start?
You start.
I feel like you should.
But I am an academic. I work with a lot of academics. I think academics are, as a species, generally amazingly, maybe purposefully oblivious to the power they have and fearful of I'm not sure what. We have some of the most secure jobs around. It's very difficult, although not impossible, to fire us. And we have access to a lot of ears, and it would strike me as unconscionable that academics would not speak up against these things and not create spaces for students to and students and communities and the communities that we're adjacent to and part of and that we're supposed to serve, to sort of, again, redirect resources for these things. And in the ways that I can, that's what it's not about me, but yes, 100%, this is our responsibility, and I hope to continue to live up to it stronger and more strongly all the time.
At our lab, direct action is one of the things that we do support. In Toronto, where I work and live, my Indigenous colleagues were and are the first to stand up against genocide. Many of us already have solidarities with Palestinian community. At our lab, we held like banner making workshops, and in Takaranto, like indigenous faculty and students and artists, and led the early marches and a call for the end of genocide in Toronto. So that's one thing to say. And as I'm a senior professor. So the other thing for me is to say, I immediately put out a statement saying that people in the university have the right to speak from their expertise in colonialism and genocide that comes either from their study or their lives, and that our research unit defends that right. And then in the kind of work we do, it is connected to land defense, which has direct action in it. When a blockade happens, you will find many of my colleagues there, which is pretty great compared to other fields. Yeah. There is a sense of that we're not of the university so much. We are with and against it. They are towards a greater purpose that we're trying to be in service of. So that is true. I do think that a lot of people get scared. An interesting thing is that our, research unit has put out very strong statements and done a lot of things, and we've had not one bit of pushback. Yeah. And I think it partly comes because we're just fearless about it. Yeah. And then in our work, it's an activism work, but it's also like sometimes it's like policy, or it's like using the genre of policy to do a kind of activism, activating indigenous jurisdiction in the form of policy, forms of address to the state. Mm-hmm. That's also, in the work. And then our lab's not art lab, it's a technoscience lab, but we do have a lot of aesthetic practice. So when we have community meetings, we have visual note taker, for example. We commission photography and art from community members. We are trying to make right now a digital toxic tour of Chemical Valley with youth. So there is a kind of, I would say, like community-based art practice as opposed to professional style art practice that is part of the work. And it's really important because the work has to be beautiful. Because who in Chemical Valley wouldn't want it to be beautiful? You don't need more horror. And secondly, the visual helps to translate highly technical things. And we found that the more and more visual we can be, the more we're able to communicate across place. And so that has been a lesson for us over time. So I don't know, the little bit of answers, but thank you for your question.
Yeah, maybe I can just briefly add, as you mentioned in my introduction, like at UBCO, we have the field lab, and it's field like FEELED. And partly like, yeah, it's a cute little pun to talk about feeling and field work. But I've noticed also with the students and also faculty I work with, how it's been important to sort of like validate that feeling in its broadest sense is both like something we can research and also something we research with. Mm-hmm. And so giving like sort of making a specific space where questions like this, like Gaza, like ongoing colonialism, like climate catastrophe that is so overwhelming, where we can work on projects both like in this kind of DIY, banner making, poster making, zine making ways, but also through more, I don't think they're more, but more properly academic projects, where students can say, like, how do I work through this dissonance? This dissonance of being, told that I have to write my comprehensive exams next week while watching, genocide on my phone, right? So like actually taking those feelings seriously as something to be put on the table, talked about, worked through, and then acted on in various ways, whether back at the university or out into the world, just a little bit more texture specifically on that question, but lots more we could say. I
think we're out of time.
More questions?
I don't know. We have till 1:45.
10 more minutes. There is a question.
Thank you so much for both talks. They were really moving. I have a question actually that maybe is building on what was just said. Death was really present in both talks. Astrida, you began by saying, in the shadow of all this death, and Murphy, you spoke about how we're caught up in each other's living but also killing. And today's the anniversary of the invasion, the full-blown invasion of Ukraine, and the bloodshed continues in Gaza. I really wanted to ask, how does mourning manifest in your work? And if you have any lessons to share in how to mourn, or what a good mourning could be. And I say this from somebody, who grew up in a society that very much puts death out of sight and has worked in conflict monitoring and more recently on the climate crisis. Thank you.
Do I have any lessons of how to mourn? When I was working on this project, my father was dying. And I remember reading a book a few years ago by an Australian author named Sophie Cunningham, and it's called City of Trees, and it's about climate change and extinction. And one of the threads that runs through the book is also Sophie talking about the death of her two fathers. And there's a part in the book where she says, I don't mean to equate these two kinds of deaths as though they were somehow like commensurable or of the same scale, like the death of my fathers on the one hand and the death of ecologies, let's call them, land-body relations. And I was sort of like, I actually got to speak with Sophie about this book, and I was kind of confused by this. Like, I think part of what this kind of work can do is to help us feel things through these vectors across scales. And I know for me, going through a really intimate and personal experience with death, where I was so lucky to have the chance to really learn about death deeply, intimately, and close to my body and in my heart for many years, taught me about death in the world in a much, I don't know, in a different way, And I think that's what's so wonderful about being human beings, is we have this possibility through our sensing bodies and knowing bodies to jump scales like this and learn things. We have, those of us who have been raised in Western cultures have such generally impoverished understandings of death and mourning. We're very afraid of it in Western cultures. We turn away from it. We put it out of view. We treat it always like it's a tragedy, as though it's not going to happen to all of us. It's a very personal sort of answer, but I would say really being able to fully go into very personal and intimate experiences with death and mourning taught me a lot more about death and mourning in a world of so much death. And that death can also be very beautiful, and death can also be very giving, and that even what dies continues in so many ways. In this, back into the water and back into our bodies and up into the sky and back. So, I don't have really any advice or lessons. It's more about not being sort of opening up to learning from these deaths, because we should definitely be learning from them. They're I don't even know how to say this without getting too emotional, but it's like, if they're all happening, how could we possibly turn away from them? So learning to mourn and learning to deal with death in ways that we do not yet know how to do. I'll speak for myself. Sorry, my earring is clinking on the microphone. Seems a very important job and a very important labor. Another colleague of mine and friend, Camilla Marambio, suggested to me about a year ago that if, the last 100, 200 years has been called, the age of progress and all of that, we all know how that turned out. What if the next age is like we spend the next hundreds of years learning to mourn, which seems like really important work, but also not in a fatalistic way. Like things die and continue, and it's like, and how will they continue is the question. A question. I don't know. That's a very hard question. That's a hard question. Maybe you have an answer.
No, really. I don't feel like I'm very good at mourning at all. I don't think I have a good wisdom there. I feel like grief is just something you're forced to ride. And the question is, can you make it as you're riding it? I think what we attune to more is like the hustle of livingness. It's always hard times. And so, what is the kind of beautiful, terrible hustle of leaning into livingness? And then maybe the hard work of solidarities, because solidarities are not at all easy. Actually, they're very, very hard. That's kind of more where I lean on that.
It's so nice that you said that in a way, because it reminded me that one of the, I think, most important lessons from the project I was doing with my sister and Patty on the whale necropsy was really beginning to understand very fully what an ecology of care in death could look like, where death it is necessary to have an ecology of different kinds of care and holding around it. And it is there all the time, it's just not always acknowledged. So sort of being able to tune in to all of that seemed actually like, could be a possible answer to your question.
I'm more like pessimism plus. grief and, sadness also. Yeah. Some of these things just cannot, you cannot turn away from those feeling states, or, it'd be wrong to try to minimize your pessimism or tuck away your grief or something like that, or make it go away quicker. But then what's the of on top of it?
Yeah, as with grief in your personal life, it comes to everybody. Having to face death is something we cannot avoid, indeed. And as with collective grief, I think, but yeah, indeed, staying with the trouble of collectivity, both in your personal grief journeys and in our collective grief, seems ever more important. I want to hit myself in the head because I have a book at home called Hospicing Modernity, and I don't remember the author, which is awful, but thank you. And I want to read that because I think this hospicing of modernity, of this possibly new period that we have to enter into, of hospicing these ideas that brought us into so much suffering, is an incredibly important collective practice. And I think with these endings that we were just going through comes new beginnings, and I think we have to take a break now so that we have energy for the next part of the symposium. So thank you so much for your talks and for everybody's questions.